Julie Keeler, president of your Vampire Cable Network. It and I are very pleased this evening to bring to you, over closed circuit, a special presentation, Audience with a Vampire, wherein Kendell Valiusa orally reports his distinguished autobiographical accomplishments as part of the official archival record, while he is ascending to the recently vacated, although tragically, seat on the International Vampyre Federation Council. Hosting this evening is on screen renowned newscaster and Renaissance man Christophe Duran, and in person, newscaster, high fashion model, and actress Daniella Mongu.
Hello, fellow vampires. I'm Christophe Duran, your co-host this evening for the audio-visual portion of Audience with a Vampire. My co-host this evening is Daniella Mongu. Daniella, what a pleasure to see you. I can't flip through a fashion magazine these days without seeing you somewhere inside, or more often than not on the cover.
So glad to be here with you, Christophe.
And yes, I do believe Kendell Valiusa has just entered the room and is headed our way through a group of back-slapping well-wishers.
The lights!
Welcome, Kendell Valiusa.
Greetings, Kendell Valiusa.
I'm so pleased to be here, Christophe, despite that it's only the death of a fellow vampire that makes it possible.
Let's begin with a question that many of us have been wondering. Is it true that you're one of the original vampires cast out of heaven by the Judeo-Christian deity when you lost a celestial battle?
Well, yes, however, we weren't vampires back then. Mainly, quote, fallen angels deprived of our wings, end quote. We became vampires only later when the Judeo-Christian god, Yahweh, unleashed a nuclear bombardment on Sodom and Gomorrah, while many of us were there in residence.
Confirmation that, despite what some people still think, Yahweh is a vindictive deity, one who has no qualms about killing thousands, turning survivors into vampires by way of gene-damaging radiation.
As you know, Daniella, Sodom and Gomorrah resulted in more than the appearance of vampires. A great number of unexpected creatures also resulted, all unpredicted, even by Almighty Yahweh. Besides vampires, those were the origin days of werewolves, shapeshifters, mothmen, chimera,
And dragons.
yes, and dragons. Those were the days, too, when my fellow outcasts and I were busy sowing seeds of discontent. False gods, false goddesses, complete with human sacrifices, all to divert Yahweh's attention from us and focus it more on his human straying sheep. Think Lilith, think Moloch, Baal, Lamashtu. Later on, of course, we conjured the Greek god Zeus, Jupiter to the Romans, and the rest of the Greco-Roman pantheon. Think of any pagan god or goddess, and one or more vampires would likely have been responsible. Those were the days, too, when we discovered non-vampires could be converted to our kind by nearly draining a victim, then giving them back a little sample of our own tainted blood. Naturally, every vampire wanted to give it a try. The more the merrier. The bigger our army, the better in dealing with the ever-growing forces of Yahweh.
After Sodom and Gomorrah, you and the other outcasts literally
Blood-sucking, as you know, Christoph, was originally only a small part of the vampiric dynamic, becoming something more as our DNA was increasingly corrupted by the radiation remaining within our bodies. We needed blood to replace necessary elements our bodies could no longer produce. And as for our pronounced canines, that came much later through scientific manipulation for easier blood dyeing. Remember, the transformation didn't happen overnight, many of us not surviving overnight. Certainly at the time, none of us conceived that we would last long enough to achieve the organization that we have today.
Jumping backwards, I've always wondered if you were with Satan when he confronted Eve in the Garden of Eden.
I was not. What was left of us, fallen angels, pretty much slavishly followed Satan's lead. Later on, of course, he became concerned with many other things, mainly his ongoing competition with Yahweh for followers, commonly leaving us to our own devices.
It said you boarded Noah's Ark to survive the flood.
Yeah, I've heard that, yes. However, it's far from the truth. That belief was subscribed to by those who thought the flood equally encompassed the whole earth. Actually, there were many remaining dry places on the planet where we fallen angels could and did take refuge.
After which, they had a little heard about you until the Tower of Babel.
Ah, yes. Those were years during which I and my fellow castouts were trying very hard to stay under the radar.
The Tower of Babel?
The brainchild of the fallen angel Faraz Belshaz, our chief nemesis, Yahweh, and his ever-increasing followers were out to get us. Disappointed, those of us who'd survived up to this point hadn't drowned in the flood. Once word about the tower got out, it attracted us like a magnet with its false promise of a way for us to reascend back to that place from which we had been thrown out. Of course, for that very same reason, it brought a concerned Yahweh running as well. By the way, to put the record straight, it was an earthquake, not Yahweh, that put an end to that particular dream.
You were with Shoshana in Europe and Senepru in Egypt.
I remained in Egypt during the founding of the Piranhas, the first world centers of knowledge that, in between campaigns, provided me many a day of it.
That's where you began acquiring languages.
My learning hieroglyphics, followed later by Sumerian and then 10 other ancient languages, accounted for my becoming known for my academics, as well as my military prowess.
That would have encompassed a time period of centuries. No one suspicious of your exceedingly long life?
Not after some clever maneuvering of family from out of town, fake deaths, clever mummifications, surprising, or maybe not, the number of delusions that can be bought with money. And by then I was accumulating a great deal of it. Spoils of war, rewards for my services, cleverly manipulated inheritances.
You knew Ramses the Great?
And Nefertiti, Amenhotep. With Ramses, I figured it was time to jettison Egypt. What with all of the Moses and Exodus business that almost saw me drowning in the Red Sea. Not to mention the deranged pharaoh Akhenaten, who brought Yahweh running when he started replacing the Egyptian pantheon with one god, the sun god Ra, and not the jealous Judeo-Christian deity.
What was it like riding with the Mongol horse?
Daniella, do you actually think that I look Oriental enough to have ridden as one of the Asian hordes sweeping westward? Even if I had been provided with a ton of theatrical makeup and an exceptional plastic surgeon to boot, I couldn't be made to look convincingly Oriental. I found it difficult enough to masquerade as an Egyptian. Not that I wouldn't have liked to join the Mongols. They were known for drinking blood, albeit mainly from their horses. My all-time favorite has to be that of the Roman Empire. I quickly and genuinely came to enjoy Roman blood sport. And, of course, there was the ease with which one could suck the blood of a slave with only the slightest chance of detection or repercussion.
So, you knew Caesar, Cleopatra, Mark Antony?
Indirectly. I always had to be careful to disguise the immensity of my accumulated fortune. For example, having been persuaded to lend money to the likes of Julius Caesar, knowing that he and other Roman bigwigs were well known for killing off their debts. It was during my Roman period that I met and befriended the physician Galen, and came in the end to abscond with all of his diaries, journals, and papers. We vampires can thank his insights on herbs and alchemist remedies for eventually enabling us to sire children. Not to mention, eventually go out like mad Englishmen into the midday sun without spontaneously combusting. And, of course, it was Galen's medical notes which eventually provided the basis for founding my own pharmaceutical house.
Speaking of children and the medical breakthroughs that allowed us to have them, were you around when Yahweh sent down his son to take on humankind's sins?
Oh, Lordy, yes. I was there for that entire dog and pony show, following each and every scenario as it played out. I, among fellow vampires, never quite figured out why Yahweh held such a bitter, never-ending grudge against his chosen people, including us, he having cast us out of paradise, depriving us of our wings so long ago. By the way, heaven never really was the paradise it's purported to be. A lot of us have come to realize that we've had far more advantages for fun, fortune, and games in being here rather than in being so-called heaven.
When was the last time that you met with Satan face to face?
During the Renaissance, when he was winning over a large number of human souls with his new toy, science. Until, that is, Yahweh stepped in with the church and plague to wipe out many of the scientists.
You do know that Satan spoke highly of you when asked about raising you to the Vampyric Council.
Yes, I do know. And I was and always will be grateful to him for his support, considering we were never really that close, and often not even on the same wavelength.
The two of you possibly becoming closer once you are sitting with him on the council?
An opportunity I will, of course, relish. I'd like to comment for a moment on my Greek period, as I like to call it. It was when I made a conscious decision to shift my focus from fighting and blood-sucking in wartime to an expanded search for knowledge. It was towards the end of this period that I eventually discovered the Library of Alexandria, all because of my meeting one-on-one with the philosopher Aristotle. You see, I was a friend of Philip of Macedonia at the time when Philip called in Aristotle to tutor his son, Alexander. A truly exceptional young man, Alexander. I ended up part of his forces, out to conquer the world. I was on the verge of bringing him over to the vampire way when he abruptly sickened and died in Babylon before I could do so.
So you and Alexander were an item?
Well, he and I did manage more than a couple pleasurable encounters while he was cohabitating with his wife, Roxana, and with his best friend, Hephaestion, and, as I sometimes suspected, with Bucephalus, his beloved horse.
And you and Aristotle?
A truly exceptional man, of whom, literally, I became a student. Only sorry that I never met, well, Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato, or Diogenes. During that time, I was live modeling for 2 nude statues, one by Praxiteles, one by Myra. The first masterpiece was lost in the Aegean during a storm. The second is presently locked in a Vatican room, Pope's permission only to enter. The room containing classical artwork deemed too erotic for the unwashed masses. As you know, I'm known for my physical beauty, and never hesitated to strip for any artist who showed appreciative interest. In fact, if you look closely, you'll find me painted on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel by none other than Michelangelo. Speaking of enjoyable personal encounters.
You and Michelangelo? My, but you did get around.
But not as much as people would think. Despite my long life expectancy and accumulated fortunes, it's not possible for any vampire, including me, to be everywhere, to personally meet everyone who makes a bump in the world history timeline, even after Leonardo da Vinci came up with the means for us vampires to fly. Actually, I really missed a lot, although I do remember quite vividly and fondly viewing Manlius Capitolinus' shattered and bloody body after being thrown off the Tarpeian Rock on ancient Rome's Capitoline Hill, and the blood-dripping bodies of Spartacus's approximately 6,000 followers on crucifixes as I walked along the Appian Way, and Caesar's bloody toga as he lay dead after the assassination on the Curia, and Nero's bloody death at the hands of his private secretary, and David Gruffett's drawing and quartering at Shrewsbury, and the swirl of bloody bathwater around Marais after his assassination by Charlotte Corday, and the gush of red blood at the beheading of Marie Antoinette. Now, that was something I'll never forget. And, on another note, the countless gourmet meals hosted by Marcus Gavius Apicus. One of my sorriest memories is somehow misplacing my autographed copy of his cookbooks. But then, I digress.
How's everything so far?
Oh, it's smashing, my dear. Absolutely smashing.
Were you there for the Crusades?
We Knights Templar were supposedly protecting pilgrims on their way to visit Jerusalem. It's more than a little ironic that we were just as busy sucking the pilgrims' blood and robbing them blind. I was busy depositing my ill-gotten gains into the Templar Bank until Pope Clement V eliminated the Templars and drained the bank. I would have been financially ruined if I hadn't always been a believer that one should never put all of one's eggs in one basket, or should I say one casket. The same could be said over the years when the Medici, the Borgia, and the Rothschild family banking empires ran into difficulties.
Was your fortune negatively affected by the stock crash of 1929?
Yes, but I was saved by having in my possession a large, unflawed ruby, once the sole eye of a Burmese idol, not stolen by me, no, but rather by a kind of Indiana Jones type who happily forfeited it rather than be sucked dry.
What about now, with all those NATO nations having labeled you as in a previous role as Russian General Stanislav Brunner, war criminal? Aren't your finances pretty much frozen in almost all the European countries and in the United States?
If you're really that concerned, Christoph, be advised that I still have plenty of assets in Russian banks, as well as banks of my own. More than enough for me to maintain the kind of lifestyle to which I've become accustomed. And remember, financial institutions lose interest in doing good, even regarding the worthiest of causes, when confronted with a potential depositor, like me, carrying several suitcases of cash.
Just how well did you know the Countess, Elizabeth Bathory, and Vlad the Impaler?
Well, I somehow did manage to count both of them among my bloodthirsty friends, despite their appearing over a century apart. I brought Elizabeth into the vampire way. Vlad had made his Passover years before I met him, recruited, I believe, by Count Wislenski of the Hungarian court. The Countess was openly appreciative as to how much her senses increased as a vampire, especially when sucking the blood of poor peasant girls while she wallowed in a warm and sticky tub of their blood. In the end, I enjoyed both's company, though for only a very short whiles. They were flagrant exhibitionists, way too out there, as far as I was concerned, their mere existence drawing the attention of vampire hunters and the law. Personally, I always court a far lower profile. In fact, I have never figured out how the Countess, caught blood red-handed, arrested, and convicted of draining the life of over 650 young victims, managed to stay alive as long as she did. And as for Vlad, what really can I add to what everyone already knows of him? Dante had already been taken under the wing of a vampire coven. Several among those vampires were ones of us tossed out of heaven. If you like, call my involvement a case of mutual simpatico. 3 of the coven vampires were taking turns feeding on him, each time draining him almost, but not completely dry. Each time, Dante would go into an ecstatic trance, have visions, and write them down as soon as he was able. Thus resulted the Divine Comedy. Something about his prior medical history of headaches, fits, and blackouts made him particularly susceptible to the frequent drops in his blood count. At the time, I was a wandering traveler, overnighting at the castle of Guido Novello de Polenta in Ravenna, where Dante was in residence.
Do I recall something about you and Plutarch in that same century?
Plutarch was like a magnet to me as well as other vampires at the time, principally because of his profound belief in humanism. Without any help from us vampires, he'd come to the conclusion that a person didn't have to follow any kind of religion to have a good life or afterlife.
Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci, all blood sucked by you?
As I frequently said, Daniella, I have always been attracted to genius. Michelangelo and Leonardo were both involved in dissecting the human body to explore anatomy, and they were very easily accessed by those of us who showed up at their doorstep with a freshly drained corpse or two. I already mentioned the portrait of me on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and Raphael did a portrait of me that hung in the villa I kept in Rome until a fire took it, along with so many of my other prized possessions. I previously mentioned the part Leonardo played in putting flying back into the vampire repertoire, essentially giving us originals, our victims and descendants, the ability to fly, having been deprived of angel wings. We made sure, after his death, to remove all traces of his writings and drawings from his Forster codices. You can, however, still see outtakes, managed by us, in the vampiric archives at Deadlow.
And what of Rasputin?
When I first met him, he'd already been turned by a member of the Russian court, Count Janik, I believe. A number of my fellow vampires and I had heard so much about Rasputin and the glory of the St. Petersburg court that we made a concerted effort, advantaged every contact, including Count Janik, to personally visit.
Was Rasputin as foul as history described him?
He was a thoroughly disgusting man, Danielle. Dirty, uncouth, unkempt. I could never understand his reputed success with women, suspecting he had simply taken most of them by force. I once asked Count Janik how he'd managed to get past the stink and the filth of that man to turn him, only to be told by the Count that, well, blood is blood is blood.
Rasputin is said to have kept the heir to the Russian throne alive by miracles using vampire blood science?
Of course. Without them, he would have been tossed aside a lot sooner.
And Shakespeare?
And Marlowe, and Sir Francis Bacon, and Sir Walter Raleigh, and Sir Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, and William Stanley, the Earl of Derby. You and our audience interested in knowing who actually wrote all those Shakespearean plays? Well, don't expect to hear the answer from me, because I really couldn't tell you. Of the vampires sucking the blood of those talented men, it was reported at one time or another, by one vampire or another, that each of those suspected Englishmen was Shakespeare. A certain vampire, Dan Denterfield, Lord of Denterfield, actually boasted that he had written Hamlet and left the manuscript on a stand next to Shakespeare's bed as a tip for good service and greater blood. For the archival records, our victims during that period were purposefully not sucked dry, but left to be partially drained again and again by others of our kind. It later became a popular drinking game, played to see how many talented individuals could have their blood sampled by the all.
You knew Bram Stoker when he was writing Dracula.
Yes, I knew Bram back then. I knew him so well, as a matter of fact, that he would often have me over in the evenings where he would read aloud to me what he'd written during the day. And then he'd ask me what I thought, without ever knowing, I'm certain, that I was a vampire. I once said to him, Bram, what you really need to do is find a real vampire to come listen and give you feedback. He just laughed and said, Kendell, you and I both know there's no such thing as a real vampire. Only maliciously degenerate individuals. Magna Veritas. You know, I was once in Transylvania not all that long ago. The government there has taken Bram's Dracula and turned it into a circus sideshow. They falsely labeled as Dracula's Castle, a building in which I doubt Vlad the Impaler ever even set foot. Vlad's real stronghold, Poyanari Castle, miles away and much less easily accessed, has fallen into wreck and ruin, more so with each passing day. Like so much of life these days, I can't help but wonder how many hoodwinked souls think they've been there and experienced the real thing when they've really not.
It is so hard to trust anyone these days.
I'm reminded, Daniela, of when I was in Florence, Italy, and this bullshitter guide tried to con me into believing the bronze Michelangelo David in the Piazzale Michelangelo overlooking the city was the original. Of course, I couldn't come right out and tell him that I was with Michelangelo when the great artist was carving the original from marble, while having sampled the tasty blood of the handsome young man who was posing for the piece at the time. I was tempted to suck the lying guy dry and toss his deflated corpse to the side of the road, but he was downright ugly, and his blood definitely didn't call out for me to drink.
You specially mentioned 1925.
1925. Now, that was an interesting year in that it saw the largest unplanned gathering of fallen angel vampires I'd seen in a long time. It was like a veritable homecoming, a class reunion, meeting so many old comrades from pre-expulsion from heaven days. The cause, of course, was the famous Scopes monkey trial. That school teacher brought before the court for teaching that humans had descended from monkeys rather than from Adam and Eve. I mean, it was just the kind of keep Yahweh out of the picture we disgruntled fallen angels had been preaching for millennia. And Yahweh was right there, too, observing the trial, masquerading as a Milwaukee insurance salesman. He obviously came prepared because all three of our assassination attempts on his life failed. I'd come not only to see the trial, but to meet and talk with H.G. Wells. It was my understanding he was scheduled to be part of the defense team. At the time, H.G. was considered by many to be the greatest futurist, surpassing even Nostradamus and even the Book of Revelation in detail. If not the greatest, well, at least the second greatest. A lot of people convinced that the title really should go to the French satirist and cartoonist Albert Robida. H.G. didn't show, though, as we all know, replaced by Clarence Darrow. Still, I stuck around for the dog and pony show, enjoying hearing all the high points the poor teacher had concocted against biblical origins. I watched Yahweh in the gallery, stewing away, as he mentally counted one after another of his human creations drifting away from worshiping him, all because of this upstart human teacher. Although the teacher lost, all of us cheered loudly for him and gladly pitched in upon hearing his punishment was a measly $100 fine.
Barely 80 years later, your blood-sucking Emilia Earhart, probably causing her blood-drained, foggy brain to steer off course.
Well, Daniela, I did meet her. Actually, though, it was Farnell Pouchon, a vampire flight dispatcher, who sucked a bit of her blood, though he always insisted, and still does, that it wasn't enough to drain her to cause her pay any less attention to her navigator.
Of course, we must ask you about Hitler.
He and his thugs were the best anti-Yahweh propaganda machine ever. Certainly better than anything with which we vampires could come up, but also the most dangerous. He was hell-bent on ridding the world of anyone and anything that wasn't Aryan. I maintained a low profile in the periphery of his organization. There were other vampires better positioned within the Nazi hierarchy than I to ingratiate him by advancing his many inhuman machinations.
Just how close were you able to get to his inner circle?
Well, I served briefly as Martin Bormann's adjutant, As party minister, he controlled access to Hitler, and more importantly, the party's vast wealth. He was present in Hitler's bunker when Hitler is reported to have committed suicide. I was ordered to locate him and, if he's still alive, assist with getting him to the rat line. I eventually located him and a Nazi colleague on a bridge just outside one of Berlin's underground train tunnels. After draining him, I stole his briefcase, leaving him pale and bloodless, lying on a rail.
After which, you somehow ended up in Hollywood.
After the war, I spent the next few years deep undercover, eventually marrying a lieutenant in the Women's Army Corps, moving in with her in her hometown of Los Angeles, California. When I felt absolutely certain that any possible prior affiliations wouldn't come back to haunt me, I sucked her dry, having tired of her, and I didn't bother to resurrect her with any of my own blood. There was a substantial clandestine vampire community in Hollywood at the time, deeply involved in filmdom, and during the course sucked the blood of more than my share of beautiful people who were, or who wanted to be, part of the industry. Not long afterward, I branched off on my own and established Draqual Media.
And how, in 1952, did you end up walking the runway at the first menswear fashion show hosted by House of Brioni, and then 5 years later end up on the cover of GQ magazine?
And please do also mention the high fashion article you wrote for English Vogue by Bespoke.
Actually, I've had more than a fair share of people wonder about how I managed the transition from, well, nothing, to wild animal skins, to military tunics, to heavy armor, to academic regalia, and finally to male haute couture. Ugly duckling to swan fashion-wise, though I've never been ugly. It's not really as strange as it may seem. A vampire like me, after all, can live for eternity. Being constantly exposed to all aspects of culture, including the stellar wardrobes of the most fashion-conscious individuals of each era, well, it's bound to rub off eventually. And believe me when I say that even Rasputin would have become more sartorial had he but lived longer.
So Satan dead, and you are now head of the International Vampyre Federation Council.
Even I have to admit surprise as to how perfectly everything went according to plan. I'll be forever thankful to you for having come up with the idea. Arranging Councilman Cluse's murder so I could campaign for his vacated seat on the International Vampyre Federation Council was brilliant, Danielle. Simply brilliant. You talked recently with Christoph. What does he have to say about all this?
He's as gobsmacked as everyone else. Yeah, congratulations. He's in order. Satan out of our way. How do you think history would regard us after we use an apostate hope? to bring about the downfall and death of the Judeo-Christian God.
History, my dear, is always written by the women.